Well, welcome to another edition of our Books and Quotes series that we are posting on Sundays. And today's book that we will feature is Dr. Richard Bernstein's Diabetes Solution. This is one of the classic books on diabetes. I think this has been bought by millions of people and has really been a help. So I would encourage you to get it. Now, I will say this, it's not exactly user-friendly. So there will be parts where your eyes may gloss over and you may just say, well, I'm going to skip this part. And there are parts that are for type 1s, but there are enough gems in here that every type 2 can benefit from this book. And the biggest gem, as far as I'm concerned, is the very first chapter where he describes his own experience as a diabetic and how he figured some things out. So we're going to go to that and just look at some of the things he has to say. He starts out with a powerful statement. He says, there are a number of myths surrounding diet and diabetes, and much of what is still considered sensible nutritional advice for diabetics can, over the long run, be fatal. In other words, there's a lot of advice going on out there, and some of it is bad advice and bad instruction that can actually kill you. He says, I know this because it almost killed me. To use a popular term politically these days, there's a lot of misinformation running around in the world. And you cannot just trust any single source. You need to find out which sources you're going to believe. Some people say, well, I think I'm just going to follow the doctor. Well, that's good. But the doctors themselves don't agree about the proper diet for diabetes, about whether it can be reversed. So many things. There is a difference of opinion. Now, thank God for that, because a generation ago, there was no difference. Almost every doctor would tell you the same thing. Cut your fat way down. Eat high carbs, but make sure they're healthy carbs. And that was pretty much it. And oh yeah, watch your sugar. That was the standard advice. You would hear it no matter what doctor you went to. That's not true today. And there are a lot of doctors that will tell you differently and tell you to cut your carbs down and cut your sugars down. Don't cut the fat down. Don't even worry about the fat. Worry about the carbs, worry about the sugars. Anyway, he starts out saying there's a lot of myths and they can kill you. So be careful who you listen to and who you follow. Now, he goes on to talk about how he got diabetes, type 1 diabetes, at the age of 12. Now, some of you may say, well, I'm type 2. I don't think this will do me any good. Yeah, it will. This book is for both type 1s and type 2s. And many of the insights he shares are going to work across the board. There are actually a number of similarities between type 1 and type 2. And one of the bigger ones is they both have to do with carbohydrates and how many you ingest. And both type 1 and type 2, if uncontrolled, can lead to the same symptoms and manifestations, what are officially called diabetic complications. And he talks about how he had frozen shoulders. Guess what? I've had 3 frozen shoulders in my early years because of high glucose and high insulin. Now, and there are a number of things. Neuropathy, type 1s can have neuropathy, type 2s can have neuropathy. So he got type 1 diabetes at age 12, juvenile diabetes, they often call it, but it doesn't have to start with children. And guess what? I looked him up today to see how old he is. He's 89 years old. That means he's had diabetes, type 1 diabetes, for 77 years, my friends. And back when he started out with type 1 diabetes, they were saying maybe you'll live 15 years. He's lived 77 years. He must be doing something right. Let me say that again. He must be doing something right, and surely he is. He talks about how in his early days, the doctors just gave him the standard advice: eat quite a few carbs, make sure they're healthy carbs, watch your sugar, take insulin. And even the insulin that they had in those days was beef and pork insulin. It wasn't even the human insulin that they give us today, or they give diabetics, not me. But anyway, he developed all kinds of complications, and he had the frozen shoulders, he had neuropathy, he had his eyesight was failing, all kinds of issues. And he went to his doctor and said, well, I've got this, and I've got this, and I've got this, and I've got this. What's my diabetes doing to me? And his doctor would say, oh, I don't think that's related to your diabetes. You're doing fine. And he just went on into his adult life. He married. He had children. It stunted his growth. He's a very short man. If you ever see him next to a normal-sized man, he's quite short. It stunted his growth. And when he would look at his children, he would think to himself, I will never live to see them grow up or see them grown. And that would probably have been true, except for one thing. He found an ad. His wife was a medical doctor. I think she was a psychiatrist, if I remember right. And she had these medical journals coming to her house, and he was looking through one of them, and he saw an ad for a blood sugar meter that could test your blood sugar and give you a reading in 1 minute. And this was new. They had no mic the meter in those days. They didn't use the testing strips like we do today and all the way we do it. But this was a meter that you could take a drop of your blood, test yourself, and in a minute's time. Today it's like 5 seconds. In those days it was a minute. But he could find out what his blood sugar was. He was elated. At that time, they were only offering this device for doctors. You couldn't even get it if you were an ordinary person that was not a doctor. But his wife, being a doctor, he had her order it for him. And when he got it, he went to town. Now, he was an engineer in those days, very brilliant man. And engineers are used to fixing problems. Their mind is always spinning around the idea of how do I fix this? They hardly know the word impossible. They're just always wanting to fix things, and he gravitated toward and had a laser focus on diabetes. Can it even be fixed? Everybody said no. You can control it a little bit, not much, and you definitely can't fix anything. Well, he did find a way to fix it. Now, as a type 1, I'm not saying he stopped taking insulin. He still has to take insulin, but he found a way to manage it, because when he finally got that blood sugar meter, he found out his blood sugar was going over 400 or around 400 milligrams per deciliter at certain times in the day and dropping down to 40 milligrams per deciliter at other times. It was bouncing all over the place. And he thought, I've got to stop all this crazy blood sugar swings. So he began to test and he began to discover things. He found out, for example, that a gram of carbohydrate would raise his blood sugar 5 milligrams per deciliter. Not many of you knew that, and almost no diabetic would know that, but he knew it. How did he know it? He tested himself with his 3-pound, $650 meter that he had ordered. Today it would probably be a couple of $1,000, but for him it was worth it. He found out that if he took insulin, the kind he was taking in those days, it would drop his blood sugar about 15 milligrams per deciliter. So he began to learn, okay, if this meal has this many carbs, it'll raise it up this high. And if I take this much insulin, it'll bring it down this much. And he began to experiment and experiment and experiment. And after a while, he realized something very, very powerful. And that is, the less carbs I eat at my meals, the less insulin I have to take, and the more precise I can be concerning keeping my blood sugar in line. His big goal was to keep it from going very high, keep it from dropping very low. And for the type 1 diabetic, that's the major issue. Goes too high at times, drops too low at times. Those terrible hypos. Blood sugar plummets. You feel terrible. You feel shaky. You may pass out. You could die. So he didn't want the lows. He didn't want the highs. He read an article in a magazine that said that they had been able to control symptoms of diabetes in animals by keeping their blood sugar at normal levels, not allowing it to go very high, not allowing it to drop very low. If they could just regulate it, they could keep them from symptoms. He went to his doctor, said, well, would that work for me? The doctor said, hey, those are animals. You're not an animal. You're a human. It wouldn't work for you. Well, he was like, well, it's worth a try. If it works in animals, maybe it'll work on me. And he began to experiment and experiment and experiment. And he learned some things. And I want to read this one quote that I think is so powerful. He says, I had the new sensation of being the boss of my own metabolic state and began to feel the same sense of accomplishment and reward I had in engineering when I solved a difficult problem. I had taught myself how to make my blood sugar levels whatever I wanted them to be. Let me just say that again. I taught myself how to get my blood sugar levels to whatever I wanted them to be. What a sense of euphoria. What a sense of control. What a sense of victory, because everybody had told him you can't do that. And sure, maybe they can with animals, but you sure couldn't. And he's like, yeah, I'm doing it. I'm doing it. How did he know he was doing it? He tested himself. So he says, I had taught myself how to make my blood sugar levels whatever I wanted them to be, was no longer on the roller coaster. Things were under my control. I could control this. One of the biggest emotional issues for newly diagnosed diabetics is, I can't control this. It's out of my control. I'm just one of the unlucky ones. There's not a thing I can do. The doctor says take meds, but he doesn't give me much hope that I'll ever see much victory. This is just beyond me. It's too big. It's too evil. It's too monstrous. But Dr. Bernstein began to do some tests and tests and test and test. And he said, hey, guess what? I can control this. I can make my blood sugar whatever I want it to be. You know what? I found the same thing out. I wasn't a type 1, but I was either a type 2 or moving close to one, and my blood sugar was bouncing all over the place, and I was passing out at one time and having all these episodes where I felt like I was about to pass out, and I started testing myself with a glucose meter, Mike the meter, and not the 3-pound one that he had back in the old days, but the more modern ones. And lo and behold, I found out that by controlling what I eat, I could control my blood sugar. It was basically the same euphoria that he experienced. Is like, I can control whether it goes up to 225 or never passes 125 by what I put in my mouth. And once I figured that out, I was off to the races. So in a way, I feel like a little miniature cousin of Dr. Bernstein. No, I'm not a doctor, and I'm not nearly as smart as he is. I don't know nearly as much as he does. But in my own small little Dennis Pollock way, I was kind of like him, figuring out with Mike the meter that I could control things. And once I did, the A1C went down, the fasting glucose went down, my symptoms went away, don't get frozen shoulders anymore. Things just smoothed out beautifully. My friend, you can as well.
If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description.